Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, we'll be talking with Travis Ruhter. Travis is a principal that serves with the Association of Washington School Principals, AWSP, as the Associate Director for the Association of Washington Student Leaders, AWSL. I've had the privilege of serving with Travis as a Tri-Director for the La Cima Bilingual Leadership Camp. We'll be actually serving this year as we move our 20th year from CISPAS Learning Center to Central Washington University to serve our 250 students in a 5-day experience on campus. Please welcome Travis Ruhter. Thank you so much for joining us, Travis. I really appreciate your time, especially in your new role for the Association of Washington Student Leaders. I'm very excited for you. I know about that, but could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your connection to public education?
Well, my name is Travis Ruhter, and I am currently serving as the Associate Director of Washington Student Leaders. It's actually a new role that the organization has created. I've worked with the organization for over 25 years and have primarily functioned in their summer camp staffs. And starting originally with Mount Baker Leadership, then right after that, we created Mount Triumph Student Leadership, and at the same time, La Cima Student Leadership Bilingual was starting, and which of course you started. And those two camps kind of went side by side with each other in their age and what they were doing and who was connected to what. And in 2011, my children got to an age where I could work more than one camp. And so I was able to start working at La Cima Bilingual during the summer and eventually became one of the tri-directors. And just last summer was my last summer in that role, which then fortuitously rolled into where I am now as the associate director, because Latino programs that are connected to AWSL are all a part of my job description, and really excited to be a part of that. I was a Spanish teacher, leadership teacher, as well as an avid cohort teacher or avid elective teacher for several years. So been in education for 26 years.
Can you just paint a little bit of the scope? I'm curious about your early career and we got now. I'm very excited to collaborate with you and just engage with you at AWSL. I'm really kind of giddy about the whole role that you're serving. But how about your whole career?
Well, my career started in 1998 when I finished teaching. I originally had the plan that I was going to become a staffer in Washington, D.C., and there was one particular congressman that I had attached myself to. He was like the only Democrat congressman at the moment in Idaho. Yes, Idaho does elect Democrats, but something happened in his family and he decided to retire. And what happened from there was my opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. ended. And I had been working with Trio Support Services, which is a really well-known program that students on the college level can access to receive other services. So I was working as a tutor, doing summer programs with them, and had always really enjoyed that. So I added a 5th and 6th year to my undergrad to be able to get my secondary education certificate and degree, and added Spanish in there so that I could always be guaranteed a teaching job, because world language teachers are few and far between. That's a really good plug for everybody who's out there who's bilingual. If you want to become an educator, we need Spanish teachers out there more than ever. And when I graduated from Idaho State University, there was no option to really get a job in Idaho. And my aunt told me, go to Washington State. And so I interviewed several places in Washington State and accepted a job at Owaco High School. And that's out on the coast. And that was a big turning point, because after my first year of teaching, a woman named Sandy Stonebreaker, who was around AWSL for years and years and involved with camp, came to my room at the end of the school year and said, you really should think about doing student leadership because you have a good energy. And from there, she connected me to Marty Fortin, who was the director of Mount Baker Leadership. And it just kept growing from there. And I left there after a while and served as a youth pastor for 3 years. And so worked in a private sector for a bit. That's when I kind of discovered that my theology and my ideas are significantly more liberal than most people. And so then I ended up being able to go back to the classroom after a few years and ended up at Mark Morris High School, where I was for over 16 years. and was able to develop a program that for a long time was just student leaders meeting once a week or once a month in the morning for about 20, 30 minutes to plan an assembly or a dress up day, to a full leadership program that is multifaceted and that actually has representation of every single group you can think of that's a part of that high school. And then, as I mentioned already, that involvement was connected to AWSL summer camps and fall conference. And as things just kept moving, I decided to seek out my principal certification through University of Washington Tacoma, a great program, and was able to study under Dr. Kurt Hatch and Dr. Chris Espelin for a year. And as I searched for jobs, it ended up that AWSL, an organization I've always wanted to work full time for, had this new position, and they approached me. And since June 16th, been just kind of rolling forward with what this is and what it looks like.
And AWSL is, for the listeners, under the umbrella of the Association of Washington School Principals. And with your new principal certification and this new opportunity you have, I really see what you're doing as a school without walls. I know AWSP has given some high school credit in projects for the Dare to Dream Academies with migrant students. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm really excited about your role. So I think you do have a vast kind of educational experience and engaging students, I guess non-traditional students, in your leadership programs. I'm curious from your perspective then, what is the purpose of public education?
Well, when I first started in my degree, I remember we had to read all these things about public education. And the thing that stunned me at the time was reading a quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he talked about the purpose of public education was to kind of rake the ground, and among the rocks, a few diamonds might show up. And that would be the purpose of public education. And I remember as a first generation college kid who grew up poor, feeling that was just an appalling way to describe why public education was created in the United States. But we do know that was kind of his opinion, and he had a lot to do in making public education happen. But I find myself diametrically opposed to that, in that the purpose of public education is really to be the champion of equitable access to dreams and future and dynamic learning that individuals want to see happen, because we know that everyone has different backgrounds, have different situations, but a public education institution that is intentional and thoughtful about how they're going to help each student reach where they want to go can pivot and move and change, so that the system itself is not feeding back onto itself. It's actually serving who it should. And it has to be dynamic enough to be able to notice when it's starting to serve itself more than serving its clients. And so I've just seen student after student that, with access to the right resources, being able to understand how to work through a system that's not always the most user-friendly to everyone, really achieve what they need. But I do think that public education will be at its zenith of being able to be functional when each student out there is in control of their own individualized education plan and has people who are helping them reach those things and removing any barriers that might be in front of them, rather than continuing to put barriers up. So those of us who work in public education every single day, that's what we've got to be watching for. Where are those barriers? Where is it stopping students from reaching their dreams? And then how do we get them to understand what's the next steps? Where's the next things that can happen for them? Because their potential is limitless, but the system often shows their limits more than their possibilities.
There's a word you used in there about intentionally connecting students that I'm curious about, how the system can do more of that. But I'm also wondering about what you've seen work out there. So if there's particular approaches that are manifesting this intention, frameworks, any policies or practices that you see that are that you would highlight and lift up and say this works well for students.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was tapped to become the first AVID elective teacher at Mark Morris, And AVID is a nationwide program that specifically works to shake up what's happening in a school when students are not receiving equitable access to their education. And that's kind of like my main, like, firsthand component that I really got to see and watch develop. And I remember it really challenging me in all my presuppositions as an educator, and finding that to be really dynamic, because AVID was created by a teacher when schools were required to be integrated in California. And she knew that it was going to be really hard to change the perspectives of white teachers as Black students and other students of color came into the school system. And so what she did was create something where she helped those students understand what was the system they were walking into, so they could know how to code switch, they could know how to actually interact underneath that to be able to be successful. And what it shows is the glimmer of what can happen if we actually remove barriers for students. Unfortunately, our system continues to require students to fit in boxes rather than the system to be dynamic around those individual needs of the students. And so even though that program in itself is not fully perfect, it shows those elements of what's possible. And I would layer on top of that when specifically you always talked about the dream of, like, what's the purpose of La Cima student leadership, and it was that we need to create Latino educators, because until Latino educators are in the schools, students won't be at the same level they should, because they need that representation. They need to see those people who have achieved that. And we know that because of multiple reasons, many individuals of color have been kind of locked out of the ability to move into those educational areas to be leaders. Because even one of the things that me and James Lehman have talked quite a bit about is the realization that there are actually more administrators in our state who are Black than who are Latino. And that kind of, seeing that urgency, and then watching our staff over the years go from not having a college education or access, and then getting there, and then watching them shift and change and move into positions where they have more say, is meeting that goal. And once we're starting to meet that goal, we realized, oh, that was really just one aspect, because there's a whole component of the system that's got to change in order for them to be successful as leaders, because even at those points, they're not always supported the way that they could be.
As you're talking, I'm realizing that La Cima, Dare to Dream Academies, AVID, a big part of what they do is grow the navigational capital for students to just even understand the structure and the institution that is academia. So with that knowledge, there's that. But then the other side is self-worth and belief and confidence and being an intellectual, I think, or, feeling smart. Or I guess the opposite is, what happens when schools make us feel dumb.
Right. Yeah. And we know that happens every day, because the system is built to send those messages over and over and over to students. And so by the time that a student gets into high school, they've heard that so many times that that's more the narrative they believe. But what's great about all those programs is I've seen students, even at the ages of 16, 17 years old, shaken out of that, and seeing that confidence grow within them and become individuals who have been incredibly successful and continuing to make change in places where we didn't think were possible.
So there's a whole aspect of fostering the self-worth, the knowledge base to navigate institutions. I'm curious about what challenges do you see in education for students and families, to achieve. And I think even, to achieve a diploma, but I have colleagues on La Cima staff who say, it's a participation award. And the message they give is like, okay, diploma, yes. First gen, yes. And then, right. So even a giant accomplishment for some families to get a high school diploma, what we know about, life in America is that you're going to need something beyond that as well. So what challenge do you see to, students kind of attaining their dreams?
Well, we know that costs continue to be one of the biggest barriers, but even the perception of costs can stop people from doing what they think that they can. But it also is important to understand that there are real barriers even beyond that systemically as students work through or think about, here's the thing that I'm going to do next. What does that look like? And then they go and they run into admissions officers, or they run into financial aid officers who don't help them and continue to create those barriers that can stop a student who's still trying to build their self-efficacy to really be successful. And I would say that the more that every single time I work with students who are moving into that realm, it's like, no, don't take no for an answer. When they say no, don't take no for an answer. You keep pushing, you keep showing that you know this, and then when you don't know, you just say one moment, and then you call someone who you're like, wait, this is what they're saying now, and like, yep, this is what they're doing now. Go back in, go do this, and continuing to get either people in those positions that are advocates for all students to be able to access what they need, rather than creating barriers to limit who can come in there. Because we're not going to make it overall as a nation unless we are educating our populace, if we're not getting everyone there. And whoever you are and however you think about what it means to make up that population, your population is your population. You know that America has always grown because of children being born and immigrants who come here. And we know that birth rate continues to drop, but immigration continues to be strong and is a great place for us to keep growing dynamically as a nation. And so as those students come in, you're able to keep seeing those students come and be a part of who we are, and because they've been here, they are us, but we still have these weird barriers that say, no, you're not really. And continuing to push past those, fight through those is really essential.
So I'm hearing an element of agency, self-advocacy that has to be learned. But then you lead me to this other question of how does public education absorb immigrant students?
Not well, because there's not a clear guidance as to like, what does this look like? There are programs that are out there, but those programs are often a little fledgling, kind of like working through, trying to make things happen. And school districts that have resources that every day, that's a large percentage of their students because it's required or demanded attention. Those districts, because since so much about what schools do is locally controlled and what resources that local entity has, those that have greater percentages of populations who deal with that, they're doing the learning, they're doing the hard work, they're figuring it out, but it's often being still contained within that within that area. So you might have Seattle Public Schools who have figured it out in particular schools, particular areas, but because of the way things are segmented throughout public education, that knowledge isn't moving through anything. So then you have a student whose family is out in Eastern Washington, out like in the Royal School District, and they're also trying to figure it out, but there's not enough networking, there's not enough. How are we building this knowledge base that is really helpful across the board? And so instead, we're investing in other things that really don't have any effect on what students really need. But I really see that as one of the biggest detriments is that we just don't have a spot where we're able to share what I've learned, what you've learned, and then the resources are pretty spotty in different areas based on the populations. Because every student who arrives is important and they have their own needs for their education. But because of the way that we look at resources and the things that we don't know, often those students get lost in the shuffle. So thankfully, there are programs like Dare to Dream Academy who are able to work. But even then, that's also who's in the know, who has access to it, who's holding those keys to let those students know, hey, there's this great opportunity in the summer. Because when I have conversations with administrators in Southwest Washington, some of them like will cock their head and look at me and be like, what are you talking about? We've never heard of Dare to Dream Academies. So again, how do we get those out there so that students are getting what they need?
Yeah, connecting to the opportunities that exist already, growing more. There's something of a constructivist perspective as well that's missed, I think, I think we know there are a lot of immigrant families coming from Latin America. And part of that in my understanding, in places like Shelton or even Longview, are there like sister cities or, regions where people are coming from Mexico who actually speak a third language, an indigenous language. So Spanish would be their second language. English would be their third language. And I'm curious about how to invite and tap the worldview, there's so much rich culture in the world. And if it's coming from even, Asia or Africa, or, you know what I mean? I think our schools say you have to fit in this model, come to American school, without acknowledging the rich, vast array of skills and knowledge and familial capital that's just is left untapped and outside of the walls. I'm curious about students that you've served and their families.
Well, I think based on what you're saying, it comes back to this little duality that we've been working with through AWSL that we're trying to get student leaders to see, and that is, are we continuing to create spaces where people fit in, and we require people to fit in, which means they have to change themselves or they have to be a certain thing, or are we actually creating spaces where people belong? And that means that they arrive and who they are and authentically themselves, and these are my needs, and here's where this goes. And then we are assessing, like, okay, for this person to belong here, what can we give them, and how are we assessing that? So when people arrive and they're part of our community because they stepped into our community, not because they have to fit in or they have to earn their spot. But if we're thinking more along the lines of okay, you're here, that means we're going to create a space that you belong. And so what are your needs? How do we make that happen? And these are the things that we can provide, rather than, oh, you must fit this model. And I think that's a great test as to, at this part of the program or this thing that we're doing, are we requiring them to fit in, or are we providing them belonging? And if we're providing belonging, then you're going to see an acceleration into equitably meeting their educational needs in that spot.
So even when we talk about we hear this kind of sentiment of global citizen, right? Where our, schools should be pairs, and here we are, global citizens in our schools, right? And I'm curious, are there any calls to action that you would offer listeners just thinking about whether it's growing navigational capital or welcoming new students or just creating belonging and connection?
I think many times educators kind of hold back what their skills are, their special knowledges, the different things from their experiences, and getting into spots to where you're working with your staff to be able to say, here's what I bring to the table, and here's what I still need to learn. And for us to be able to create those spaces, because a lot of times, the experts are often already in the room, but have the space been provided for those conversations? And until you're really getting that out and you're collaborating in such a way that those things can be revealed, then you can start to look as to, okay, so now what more are we missing? What more could we be doing? How could we grow together? Because public education is incredibly siloed, and it's even built with the way that we do things, right? We send 25 students into a classroom with one teacher, no other adults, the door closes, and they're like, well, we hope that learning is happening. Whereas that if those were open doors with lots of different adults that came through and other experts, how much more dynamic that learning would be, rather than just resting it all on the shoulders of one individual who has great skills. Because I've been that person, and you work really hard, but you find that you meet the needs of students better when there's other people who are observing and seeing and looking at, like, what is it that the students need? What's the student experience? Because we get so focused on what's the teacher instructing or what's the teacher doing. Specifically in the last 20 became a lot about that and not about the student experience.
Sounds like everybody needs empowered, right?
Yes.
The educators, the students, families. I'm gonna, I think, probably leave with that question is empowerment, this notion of navigational capital and advocacy and agency, as well as the overarching belonging, connection, and inclusion of all voices. I'm curious what you've seen work really well in terms of educator collaboration when you think about, adults being alone, right, in a classroom.
Yeah.
Not, and there's no time, right? I'm curious, like education does, as it is now, does not allow a lot of time to collaborate. And I think adults often feel teachers depleted right? When you actually don't have your own kind of camaraderie or kind of horizontal collaboration. And I mean that educators with educators. So what have you
Yeah.
seen work there?
Well, exactly what you said. When the time was given for us to be able to collaborate and really keep in the forefront what was needed, what did the student need, and really keeping those students at the center of what was happening, those were the most dynamic experiences. Anytime I've had the opportunity to co-teach or co-lead or co-facilitate anything with anyone, I see that glimmer of like what it would look and feel like. So when we were putting Avid together at Mark Morris, you're required to have an Avid site team, and you're working with those individuals to create that program. And so you're making extra time for meetings, and there's volunteer time that goes on, and there's all that work that is a part of it. Going to like Summer Institute and spending multiple hours together, dreaming about that, looking at it, working through the issues. And it really was like the more people whose minds were there, focused on specifically the student need, the more dynamic it became. And I think that's what's essential is clearly what is it the student needs, but you can't figure out what the student needs. I mean, you can do all the empathy mapping and thinking through an expertise, but you need that student voice in there as well. You have to have the students say, here's really what I need, and here's what I don't know that I need. And then that's where you as the expert educator can come in and like ask questions and kind of lead through that. Because that's one of the things I learned in my first year of student leadership was don't tell students, don't be a psychiatrist, don't write a prescription and say, here's what you need to do. Be the psychologist, be the person who asks the questions. Like, what is it that you feel that you're needing? What are you noticing? And they're like, I really don't know. And then that's where you explore further and ask those over and over, that why and that what, and they eventually answer it.
Makes me think about motivational interviewing, just the approaches that are out there. In these conversations, I'm leading to, I think the next podcast series will be about educational innovations.
Yeah, yeah. and having people who begin to incentivize, not just around like, oh, let's have a charter school do this or let's have this do this, but like just even regular public schools, like what can you do? Here's this experiment, see what this would look like. What can you make happen with this? And you need that leadership to make that happen in your districts, because some districts definitely do have leaders who are looking to innovate, and other districts have people who are just complying with what's the new thing that OSPI says that you should do. And that compliance is what, for one way or another, just continues to breed complacency and lack of innovation.
But I think if you give it back to a group of teachers, right, who really love their craft, right, and love young people,
Mm-hmm.
and say, hey, go reinvent this, how many different approaches and experiments. So I think there's space required for experimentation and innovation, and then scaling.
Yeah. Your true teacher's heart, that's what fans the flame of it. And where many of your teachers are now is because that flame has become so small or has been extinguished because of so many things that wrap around it. But I know every time that I work with teachers, when they see the thing that this actually is going to make a difference, you see them become reinvigorated, because that's why they became an educator.
Brings me back to AWSL, La Cima, Mount Baker, Mount Triumph, all the staffs I got to be on. What is really happening in there? And when students' lives are shifted, changed, like the spirit of folks is moved, right? And invigorated. And that is, to me, a clear example of what education can be.
Yeah. People will walk out of those weeks and they'll say, that filled my cup. I can go back for a year and do what I'm doing. And I always try to say, treat every day as if it were camp. And so anyone who's had a camp experience, like that's my mindset. So when things are tough and I'm in the classroom and there's bureaucracy or there's this or this or that, but I remember when the student walks in my door, this is camp for them. They had to leave their house. They had to come here. They had to bring some things with them. They're going to have some snacks. They're going to have some playtime, like everything that a camp is. And the way that we approach camp is a different mindset. But what if we said every day at school is camp, and kids adopt that as well? Something new to be explored, some great experience, some new opportunity, rather than just the drudgery of like this is how we do things every single day.
Think about all the opportunities. So in a 6-day leadership camp, which have very full days, right? It's really kind of a concentrated learning community. And to me, the power is in its brevity, is that it's, we're not doing this for a whole semester. So I even wonder about a focus on science, for maybe a 2 or 3 week period where you come for 4 or 5 days, you go out, you do all your other experiments. I just see there's so many more. This is just my mind, let alone like millions of educators to say, let's go innovate. This conversation is really invigorating and thinking about, what is possible in public education. And for me, I keep saying public because that to me is key, right? I know there's a move to privatize education, and I think that is not equity, right? That is the opposite of saying every young person in America. Well, it's law, right, for compulsory education to exist and provide for our young people, but they're leaving. Parents and students are leaving the public system for other options, for other homeschooling and charters and just all of the private schools. And I think there's a real crisis in public ed and needs reinvigorated. I'm curious though about your experience. I'm closing these interviews up with like, okay, what was your schooling experience? How did it impact you? What did it do for your spirit? Did it uplift you? Did it empower you? Did it crush you? I'm curious, what was school like for you?
I don't know why, but well, it's probably why I became a teacher. Like school was my place. It's where I belonged. It's where I found who I was, what my potential was going to be. I would be nothing. I would not be where I am if it hadn't been for the work and the inspiration of all of those adults around me, all those people around me who just said, keep going, keep doing, right? You've got a lot going for you. You're a smart kid. Right. There's this or this, right? People who told me positive narratives about myself, even when I didn't believe it about myself. And I can go through and name all the teachers who did it. But like my high school science teacher, who wasn't the most popular teacher in the world, but she was with kids because of the way that they perceived her. But she was unexpectedly the person who shifted how I was going to get to college. She did Avid with me as a first gen student. Because my parents were always like, you have to go to college, you have to do this, but they had no idea how to do it. And without her guidance and like her saying like, that applications are due, right? And I'm like, what are you talking about? I didn't have any clue about application due dates or how to apply for scholarships or whatever it would be. Everything that I experienced in my education was because someone saw who I was and said, this would be good for Travis. And then they approached me and said, you should apply for this or you should have this experience. And so, although I know that I worked hard through all of that and I've gotten to where I am because I was consistent in working, all the opportunities I had, I never would have known unless someone was pointing them out to me because it wasn't something that I ever saw. So all the way through my whole life, it's been that way, is how I would say it. It was really good to have people around me for a long time who believed in what I could do before I even understood it. So that's what I've tried to do with all my students. Like every single time I saw a kid step into my room, like what's this thing about the student that they don't realize yet? What's their blind spot? What can I show them so that they realize this great thing about them? So they can untap a potential, so they can keep dreaming, keep going. So it's just like getting involved in AWSL, right? It's because someone observed what I did all year with kids, and I wasn't super aware of everything I was doing. I was just doing my job. And having that person come in and said, you'd be really good at this. Maybe you should do this. And I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. So there was that willingness to always give it a try. But I know there's many things I wouldn't have done if someone hadn't sat me down and said, you should look at this.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.